We are looking at a powerful story today, a really great story. Many people have said that this is the most beautiful short story ever written. It's a great story, and like many stories, it has all kinds of drama going on in it. There's anxiety, there's fear, there's love, there's loyalty, there's commitment, there's ups and downs, and there's moments of crisis, and then there's redemption. It's a book that starts with despair and it ends with delight. It's a powerful, wonderful story. Benjamin Franklin tells of how he read this story to his literary club once, and after he had finished reading it, they were delighting about it and just so excited, wanted to know where he had found such a remarkable story. And as he tells it, he delighted in telling them, well, it's from the Bible, the book of Ruth. And so today we are looking at the book of Ruth. And I hope today that we can see that Ruth points us toward Jesus, seeing Jesus in the book of Ruth. We see the gospel in Ruth. We see ourselves in Ruth. Ruth, as earlier this summer I asked, as we were thinking about this series about Old Testament heroes and how they point to Jesus, I asked, who's your favorite Old Testament hero, your favorite Old Testament story? And somebody shouted out Ruth. I don't remember who that was, but somebody shouted that out. Maybe several shouted that out. Ruth was one of the heroes. It's one of the great stories from the Old Testament. It's just 4 chapters long. It's a small book with a huge message. A little book with a big message. It's tucked between Judges and 1 Samuel, and it's kind of like the eye of a storm in a hurricane of turmoil and troubles that are going on around it. All of a sudden, Ruth appears in the middle of this and brings a little ray of hope. So the setting is, the book of Ruth emerges out of dark times. It's dark in this period of Israel's history and the history of the world. The book of Judges, just before it, ends with these words in Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. And so because everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes, sin was rampant, people's hearts were hard. It was like, do whatever you want, do your own thing, whatever seems right to you, just do that. Truth is just whatever you say it is, whatever you feel is right, just do that. Sound familiar? But in the midst of that, and in the midst of all the confusion that was bringing, and the storms and the turmoils that result from disobedience, everyone was doing right in their own eyes, doing their own thing, except for Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. They are the exception. You can be the exception. You can be an exceptional exception in the cultural climate of our day. That's where I pray that your heart lands today as we consider this story, that you consider yourself to be among those who can be the exception in a time where things are very confusing in the cultural climate of our day. I hope you can put yourself in the story and relate to it in that kind of way, that you can come out of this like Ruth and be an example to others. So, Ruth, chapter 1, I'd like to read the first couple verses just to get us into the story. In the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem. Remember Bethlehem? Remember Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Remember what this is pointing to? Bethlehem in Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. They left their home. They went to this new place. Crops have failed. The garden's all dried up. The rain isn't happening. There's a crisis of hunger. There's a famine. Starvation is all around them. So Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons moved to the country of Moab. A journey of, it would have been over 100 miles. So it was, it'd take at least a week of walking with their belongings. Moab was not friendly territory, so they were not going to a great place. It was not culturally great for them to be moving to Moab, but it was the best place where there was good soil and rainfall, and they could grow their crops and not starve. So Elimelech moves his family there, and they get settled in, and then Elimelech dies. And then the two sons marry Moabite women, and things are starting to look promising. They're rebuilding their family, they're getting settled. The two sons then die. It says in the passage that Chilion and Mahlon died. Mother, Naomi, is now a widow, and Orpah and Ruth are now widows, so the three of them. Naomi and Orpah and Ruth are widows. And widows in that season of the world, in that time, in that culture, that would have been devastating to be a widow in that culture. Especially for Naomi, who would have been a foreigner. She was an Israelite living in a foreign land, and she has lost everything. She's lost her husband. She's lost her economic provision. She's lost, it's all gone. Her sons are gone. And there was no social security system. She had no provider, no protector. So that would have been devastating for them. They were on the verge of being homeless, without a home. And so this is a crisis moment in the story. This looks bad. It looks really troubling for Naomi and Orpah and Ruth. The family is really being torn apart by the circumstances. And so Naomi urges the two daughters to go back to your original families, go back to your original homes, and I will move on. And her moving back to Israel, moving back to her home, that means she would be going home alone, destitute, feeling hopeless and bitter. She's lost everything. And so she expresses her feelings in verse 20. Don't call me Naomi. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter, hopeless, and despair. And for Ruth and Orpah, there's a big moment of decision ahead of them. Do they go with Ruth, or do they stay home? She's already encouraged them to go back to their homes. Orpah had started out with Naomi. She started on the journey with her, but then as Naomi's encouraging her, she bails. Orpah bails, backs out, goes back home. By the way, that happens too often in our day, doesn't it? People start with Jesus, but then they don't make a commitment, don't express their loyalty to become his disciple and his apprentice, and they bail. And they disappear from the story, like Orpah. She disappeared. But Ruth, listen to how she says it. Ruth, in the midst of ashes, we see God's grace shine. In the middle of a really confusing, bad storm of circumstances, we see a core of hope. In the darkness, a light shines. Ruth turns on a light of loyalty. And it's a beautiful thing. It brings this beautiful moment into the story as Naomi is encouraging the two daughters to go. Orpah does, she bails, but Ruth says this in verse 16. Look ahead in chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Wow, do you hear the commitment? Do you hear the loyalty? Do you hear the beauty of what she's saying coming alongside her mother-in-law, Naomi? And going with Naomi would have been she's going as a foreigner and as an outsider, and there were huge risks to that, so many unknowns, but her relationship with Naomi drove her to enter into actually what's expressed there, a relationship with God, which is the bigger commitment that she is making. She's making a commitment to Naomi, and she's making a commitment to God, who she had learned about from Naomi. Ruth demonstrates commitment to relationship on this path to redemption in this story of Ruth. For Ruth, she entered into this relationship with Naomi, and she learned about God, and she stuck with her. She had this commitment. By the way, we could really learn from that part of the story. Naomi had built this relationship with Ruth, and because of that, Ruth is entering into a relationship with God. Isn't that a great invitation for us? Build relationships with people so that they can enter into a relationship with God. As we build friendships with those around us, the hope is that they would also enter into a friendship with God, who we love, and we want people to come in to the kingdom. So Ruth's story reveals the redemption that we so desperately need, the relationship that we desperately need that brings peace and hope. Now think about Naomi for a moment. She goes to Moab with her husbands and her sons. She left her friends, her country, her family. We don't know whether she wanted to go or not, but she continued to walk with God. She continued to journey with God and her immediate family and her 2 sons, even as they married Moabite women. And Naomi worshiped the God of Israel. She worshiped God even when the entire culture around her was bowing to Baal. There was idol worship going on. Naomi stayed true to the gospel, and she invested herself in Ruth and taught Ruth about God. And then we see Ruth become a woman who was extremely loyal to Naomi and to the God that she had met, the God that she had entered into a relationship with. And she stayed with her mother-in-law when she didn't have to. She put her faith in God through Naomi's example. And then she helped Naomi trust in God when Naomi was feeling down and helpless. There was a relationship there that was built in a relationship with God. And then Ruth works really hard to gather grain for the both of them. And when we come to chapter 2 in Ruth's story, we find Ruth gleaning in this field of Boaz. Now this was something that God instituted to help the poor. In the harvesting of grain, a landowner was to leave grain behind so that the poor could harvest it, so that they could glean, they could pick up the leftovers, really. Hard work, but it was for the poor. So they were thinking about the poor in their harvesting. And so Ruth is out gleaning in this field of Boaz. And now is when the story really turns to what seems to be kind of a love story. Ruth is out working hard, picking up the grain in this field of Boaz. And listen to what Boaz says in verse 5. Boaz comes back around, he's the landowner. He asked his foreman, "Who's that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" I would love to hear how he actually said that. You could hear in the background, he took notice of this particular woman, Ruth. And he is very kind to her. He expresses incredible kindness to her. And he's giving to her, and he's helping her, and leaving her with more grain than she can handle. And he's generous with her. It's clear that he's drawn to her in this story. And a story of love seems to be developing, but the story of Ruth is much more than a love story. It's way beyond that. It's a love story that really takes the whole story to a story of redemption. A story of love that leads to redemption that they needed and we so desperately need. At the end of chapter 1, Ruth and Naomi were empty. By the end of chapter 2, they're full. What happened? Boaz comes on to the scene. And this is mentioned that he's also called a family redeemer, a kinsman redeemer. Listen to how it's expressed in chapter 2, verse 20. "The Lord bless him," Naomi says, talking about Boaz. He said to her daughter-in-law, she said to her daughter-in-law, "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He's one of our kinsmen redeemers." Now, just a little background here to explain that. Boaz was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's husband who had died. So Boaz is his relative. So he was a kinsman redeemer, a family redeemer, it would have been called. You can read about this in Leviticus 25. Since God had assigned each family in each tribe a section of land so that they could have their inheritance and live in the land, that land was extremely important to Israel and to the family, still is, so that it was a place for people. And in order to make sure that it stayed in the family line and preserved the family line, the kinsman redeemer law was instituted. So that if a man died and left a widow, so that she had no sons, then the nearest relative could marry the widow, and he could buy the land, and it would give him the opportunity to allow her to have sons and carry on the family name. So this law was set in place to keep the family line going. This was important in the culture of that day. To keep the heritage, to keep the family line going. And we'll see in a couple minutes how that is so significant in this story of Ruth. So Boaz is a family redeemer, a kinsman redeemer. And here is why that's significant in this story, because Ruth's story points to Jesus as our Redeemer. This whole story, consider how this unfolds. Now, chapter 3, some of you have read it already. Some of you love the book of Ruth. Chapter 3, in a couple places, kind of makes you hold your breath and scratch your head. What's going on there? If you read it for the first time, it's like, what is this all about? Now, Ruth, if she had any perfume, I think she probably put on some perfume, put on her dress, her best clothes, and she goes to the threshing floor where Boaz is sleeping. And while he is sleeping, while Boaz is sleeping, she lies down next to him at his feet, and she takes the covers off his feet and lies down there, and in the middle of the night, Boaz wakes up and discovers there's a woman at his feet. And so, who is this woman laying at his feet? And so she identifies herself as Ruth. And then it says in chapter 3, verse 9, she says this, "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." That same word, it's really cool, that same word for covering was already mentioned back in chapter 2, verse 12, when Boaz says to Naomi, "May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings," the wings, that original Hebrew word, it's translated wings there, covering, same word, and they go together in a beautiful, marvelous way. All this sounds strange to us in our culture, but the culture of that time, they understood what Ruth was doing was asking Boaz to be her family redeemer. And it really is a marriage proposal, that she's making herself available to be married to Boaz, and that he could be her redeemer and provider and take care of her and continue on the family line. Part of this is, in that culture, the kinsman redeemer couldn't just decide to buy the land and marry the widow. The widow had to ask. But Ruth is asking. And Boaz is all in. It's so cool, the story. Boaz is all in for this. She's asking. She's basically proposing to be married and for him to be her kinsman redeemer. And Boaz is all in. He was willing to pay the price, to do whatever it takes to redeem Ruth. And that included being honest and truthful and the man of integrity that he was about the fact that there was actually a closer relative. So he brings this up, and Boaz goes to that closer relative. You can read about that in chapter 4, and he works out the agreement. The closer relative was not willing to pay the price. Boaz was. And you can hear that moment in the story if you read chapter 4, where he's offering the other kinsman redeemer, because he's closer in line as a relative, that he could buy the land and marry the widow. And when he finds out how much it's going to cost him, it's like he was not willing to pay the price. So you can see this moment in the story where Boaz is like, yes, what's happened? It's mine to pay for. And Boaz was willing to pay for the land and marry and do whatever it takes to redeem her and her family and continue on this family heritage, this family line. Why is that all important? Because it points to Jesus. Way back then in this story, it's pointing ahead toward Jesus, who was willing to pay the price. Boaz was willing to do what it took to redeem. Jesus did everything at great cost at the cross to redeem us, to pay the cost for our sin so that we can be forgiven and free and enter into a relationship with Him. A marriage really with Him. A relationship with Jesus that puts us in a place of relationship with a holy God. And so you have this, all this points to Jesus. Boaz welcomed an outsider Ruth from a foreign country into his family. Just like us, right? We are outsiders, welcomed into his family by faith. Just as Boaz gave Ruth a future full of hope, Jesus gives us a future full of eternal hope. We are Ruth. Put yourself in that story. We are Ruth. And what is needed is for us to set our lives down at the feet of Jesus and ask him to cover us, to spread his wings over us, to grant to us his covering, his holiness, his redemption, his salvation, a relationship with him that is forever. It's in our hands to ask. God gave us a will. God loves you and wants to have a relationship with you for all of eternity. But he's waiting for us to ask him. Many of you have. And you're in that process and you continue to ask him, cover me. Cover me with the corner of your holy robes. Grow my relationship with you. We ask and we continue to lean into that. We invite him to cover us. And something else that's really important in this whole story of Ruth. Ruth's story really points to our loving God at work behind the scenes. As you read this story, throughout the entire story, there's this overriding theme of the providential sovereignty of God. He's seen everywhere, weaving his purposes, weaving his grace into the people, into the events and the circumstances they were facing. He uses a family to bring a Jewish man and his family to Moab, and Ruth is now drawn in to the family with this beautiful love story that God knew all about all along, and in his sovereignty, he's putting this beautiful plan together to make this all come to a place where it all points to God's love and his sovereignty in the background in drawing us to him so that we can have an eternal relationship with him. God is at work, and he's revealing his mercy and compassion to you in the process. I pray you're able to see it. I don't know where your story is right now, even if you're in a season of famine, even when you feel like an outsider, even though you feel completely unaware of what's happening or why it's happening. There's very little understanding of the circumstances you're going through right now. Somehow, God is guiding your decisions and your choices and your events and your circumstances. He's working things to the good for your best good and for his greatest glory. God's at work. It's one of the beautiful things I love about the story of Ruth. It's a great love story. It's a great story of redemption. But it's also a powerful story of how God works behind the scenes in the middle of very dark times to do something that brings this ray of hope. This beautiful thing about a love relationship with God. There's a wonderful scene in the closing words of Ruth where God brings everything to this place of wonderful hope and peace. Listen to these words in chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Ruth gets married to Boaz, and they have a son who eventually appears in the family album of King David, which is in the family tree that leads to Messiah, Jesus. Boaz and Ruth have this wonderful joy of passing on their faith to future generations. A story that began with despair, hopeless, broken family in a foreign land, now to this place where they're in position to leave a legacy, to have an offspring, to have people beyond them that point to Jesus in very dark times. Ruth is a loyal love story. How Ruth went from being a foreigner to a follower to a faithful, fruitful follower that pointed to the glory of God. This delightful ending to her book. Her life points to the bigger story of Jesus. Everything about the book of Ruth points to Jesus. Just as God plucked Ruth out of a rough world and adopted her into a family faith tree, maybe you are or will be the first in your family line to be drawn in to the family of God, walking in a relationship with Jesus. Your spiritual scrapbook might just be getting started, but there's so much ahead, so much to look forward to. Maybe you're continuing a long-established family heritage of faith, and you're leaning into that, and you want to add to that, and leave a legacy ahead. Think about future generations. You have the capacity to have a... Naomi and Ruth had no idea, and Boaz had no idea of the ripple effects of their faithfulness to God, and how that pointed the way for others to discover a relationship with Jesus. So walk it out with me with a couple of questions. Let me ask, in what ways is your story? You have a story. How is your story being drawn into the bigger story of Jesus? You might not really be able to identify that easily. It might take some thought. I would encourage you to think about that this week. How is what's going on in my life right now, how is my story being drawn into God's bigger story? Because when we come to faith in Jesus and lay our lives down at His feet, it's not like He becomes a part of our story. We become a part of His. He draws us into something more and bigger, a bigger story. How is your story being drawn in to the story of Jesus, the great story of redemption? You might feel like your story is lacking right now, and there's more to come, but there is more to come. He weaves His grace and His mercy and compassion into your life in ways that we need to look for it and watch for it and be aware of how God is working things to the good for His own eternal glory. You know, maybe in your life there's some relationship that's just now developing, like Naomi and Ruth had. Maybe you're the Naomi, maybe you're the Ruth, but maybe there's some relationship that you could just commit to taking a little deeper, because that relationship could help you go deeper in Jesus and that person that you're building a friendship with. That they could discover the joy of being wrapped up in the story of Jesus. And what would it look like for you to be the exception in the cultural climate of our day? Would you agree that our culture these days is confused, in dark times, so much division, so much polarization, so much political turmoil, so much going on that could be confusing, and we wonder where the hope is? God wants us to be part of the exception to the culture, to show people that there is hope. There's hope in Jesus, and a relationship with Jesus is something profound that will help us to help others to find hope. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for this beautiful story of Ruth. Thank you for her example. Thank you for her loyalty and her commitment. Thank you that she demonstrates someone who was drawn in as an outsider and entered into this beautiful relationship with you. And you provided her with the capacity to leave a legacy that points to Jesus. Her family line is mentioned in the first chapter of the book of Matthew. That genealogy, that legacy, that her life points to Jesus. We want our lives to point to you. Help us to recognize what you're doing in our life. Help us to see, Father, the beautiful things that you are making out of us. Help us to be people of hope who share with those around us in a way that draws them to you as you build your kingdom. And we thank you for every opportunity you give us. Thank you for the victory that you bring as we walk in friendship with you, in close fellowship with you, as we trust you. Help us, Father, to lean in and trust you all the more and to walk in the victory that you have for us. Father, may victory come to your glory. May our victory be in Jesus, and in that name alone. Amen.